Good morning. Today, happy Friday, I'd like to talk a little bit about the nature of spirituality and science. So, the relationship between spirituality and science is that the science is based on the scientific method, which is a method of observation and note taking. And this basically allows us to get a vague sense of patterns and outlines and maybe test some ideas. But one of the things that the scientific method is not so clear on, they just vaguely touch on the fact that the scientific method is entirely dependent on observation. And if we look at physics and if we look at string theory, we see that observation is the greater part of manipulation, so that the observer is much more important than the actual test. So the scientific method has so little application. It is used in the way it can be. We come up with new inventions and it is used to test theories. But the scientific method is so entirely dependent on the observer that it really, once we go further into what science actually means, we start looking at the observer, because the observer is going to be who's going to flaw the data. The observer is going to have a bias or a prejudice. The observer is going to miss the data. The observer is going to try to frame the data in a way that is not as accurate as the data itself is. So the scientific people like to say that science is real and that everything else is kind of fake. But this is basically the blind worship of science, because any real scientist, anyone who actually does science and uses the scientific method regularly, knows that the observer is the biggest part of the equation, and knows that, companies often pay scientists to fudge data. They say, you're the observer, you have power here, use your observer power to make this scientific experiment, tell us what we want to hear. This is a very, very common practice in the industry. I had a roommate once that said, government contracts are really reliable, they pay well, and you got employment for a while, but they're horrible because the government tells them to get the results that the government wants. The government doesn't allow the independently contracted scientists to come up with their own conclusions. They demand that they get the results they want. They say, if you come up with the results that disprove what we want you to prove, don't give them to us, we're not going to pay you for that. So so the scientific method, the basis for science, is, I'm not going to say flawed, I'm going to say incomplete. I'm going to say it points to self-discovery is the real science, because the observer limits the scientific method more than the scientific method can tell us. This is I don't comprehend why this isn't super common knowledge, why this isn't taught along with the scientific method, that the observer is the greater part of the equation than the scientific method. So spirituality is all about self-study. It's saying that we see the external world as we see our internal world. And it's saying that there's a direct correlation between what we think, feel, and experience inside and what happens outside. So spirituality says that this is the primary mode of our being, and the scientific method confirms this by saying that the scientific method is worthless without, observation of an observer. The scientific method, as far as I know, does not include anything that stipulates anything about the observer. Not a zero thing. So it is, the scientific method is an incomplete system. It misses, it lacks even like a 50%. It is less than 50% of any experiment. It is much more accurate to map out, if we want to make an experiment, to map out our biases, to map out our beliefs, to map out our preconceived notions, to map out everything we can possibly come up with on a subject, and then go out and take a bunch of observations and then compare. If we do this over and over again, we're going to start collecting real data. If we're trying to apply an isolated scientific method that's not accounting for our personal opinion, or is spending less than half of the time focused on the observer, then it's basically worthless data, because we're accepting flaws to begin with. We're accepting unconsciousness to muddy the equation. Or a mathematician would say, why would you even bother? So that's how I feel about science. I was really into science growing up, and I just became more and more disappointed with it over time, in all different ways. To the point where I started just having to look for more. I'm like, physics and astronomy is all right, but it seems like it's just missing a lot. It doesn't seem like it seems to disprove itself too often and not know. This pattern kept coming up of science saying that it didn't know, and then trying to say something that made it seem like it was really important and that it wasn't that important to know that thing. And so my curiosity said, why is science all of a sudden trying to cover its tracks, the fact that it doesn't know things? And then I started becoming exposed in my later teens to more diverse works from around the world. Hinduism is such a large, valuable block of information. I started being exposed to small amounts of this and started hearing these wild ideas. They sounded really wild to me at the time that I couldn't make any sense of, but I was curious about them because science, again, was disappointing me. At that time, NASA was cutting all of their missions, so I had, as a young teen, researched all these NASA missions and what they're going to teach us and when they were launching. And then, a year before the launch date, because they plan these things like 6 to 8 years in advance or more sometimes, a year before the launch date, 2 years before the launch date, they say, oh, this mission is scrapped. They did that to 90% of the missions. NASA's budget was just like clear cut, and all of a sudden we didn't have these missions. So I'd spent all this time getting invested and researching and being excited about these things, and then they just didn't happen. And then every once in a while I'd see like a nature documentary, a discovery documentary, interviewing some of these scientists, and they're like, yeah, our budget got cut. They told us to go to the junk pile and try to find some parts to make the mission work, but this is a real science mission. We can't just go looking through a junk pile. Yes, we've had to go looking through the junk pile to make our previous missions work, but that's why they fail all the time. We can't be using old junk to make our modern science experiments. So my faith in NASA and in so-called modern science just quickly bottomed out in my late teens, early 20s. I still kept up with it. I still keep up with it a little bit, but it became painfully clear that there was something huge missing here. One, NASA, the organization that's supposed to be exploring space from my perspective, actually wasn't exploring space, and the scientists were not at fault. The scientists were like, hey, why aren't we exploring space? We just spent 8 years researching this project, developing the technology, computer simulations, training, and now we don't have the budget for it, and now you're telling us to look through scrap pile? Anyways, so going back to the scientific method, in this case, the scientific method would say, why didn't those missions work, or why don't we know more about the sky? And the answer is money. And money is power and control. So someone didn't want those experiments to happen. It's not like there's not enough money to go around. We know we spend billions of dollars on pointless things that don't accomplish us much. So we know there's plenty of money to go around for these kinds of things. We just the people in charge have devalued this. And so I started switching up for other things. Science and Consciousness Conference, I think I was maybe 16 or 17 when I went to that. So it was basically the crossover. It was saying, okay, here's our leading physicists, here's the leading astronomers who have experienced spirituality and can put it into more scientific terms. Because the scientific method is so flawed, we have to come up with new language to talk about this stuff, or ancient language to talk about this stuff, which is metaphorical. Either way, it's a little tricky to talk about spirituality because it is cutting-edge science. It goes beyond what can be seen just with our regular senses. Spirituality science requires that we make use of much more advanced information. We need to be able to have a physics mind. We need to be able to visualize things happening. This is what physicists and aero engineers and all these advanced engineers and designers need to be able to visualize. This is creative visualization with the third eye. This is very spiritual work, essentially. They are they are blending mechanical and spiritual work. Spirituality is supposed to be applied to everything. It's not its own magical fairyland. Spirituality is the greater of the sciences. Spirituality incorporates all the sciences. The nature of reality is spirituality, and the nature of reality includes mathematics, it includes physics, it includes emotions. This is the nature of reality. So to say that for some reason psychology can all of a sudden be a cut and dry science that's perfect on its own, when all it does is follow the scientific method and doesn't have a system for taking care of the observer, or even acknowledging who the observer is. Our newest, most advanced forms of psychology are just barely touching on this concept that the observer, the person taking the data, the psychologist, is really the person who's manipulating the data unconsciously to the point where their data is virtually worthless. This is something I've read a number of psychology books that are just worthless. They're one person with one idea that wrote it out over the course of 300 pages, and it wasn't a very good idea. They hadn't reached self-discovery. Most people that are contributing to the literary world of science have not reached a state of self-discovery. They are still emotionally afraid of exploring their their emotions and their motivations. If we don't know what motivates us, if we're not checking in with ourselves and we don't know what's motivating ourselves, we're literally being controlled by our unconscious or anyone else who can control our unconscious. And psychology, in its cut and dry Western mind version, is all about controlling people's unconscious and subconscious. So psychology is really, I'm not going to say anything is evil, but psychology is the tool that is used to perpetrate most of the evil in most places. I'm not going to, again, psychology isn't bad, but by having zero empathy for the observer, by saying me as an observer, I have no way of manipulating this data in any bad way, I'm only perfect. This dichotomy right here is a lack of empathy. We're not having empathy for our impact on our work. And this is what psychologists do in this country and in most modern civilized countries. This has become the new standard. To not have self-discovery be part of the process. If you go to any healer, any wise man, any person of great importance in any tribe across the world, all of them do the same thing. They meditate and they create solutions. They examine themselves so deeply that they've seen the archetypes of all of humanity within themselves, or enough that they can start recognizing them, and they've gone beyond transpersonal psychology. Transpersonal psychology is where we see that there's certain patterns in psychology that affect everyone. They've gone on to transcendental psychology, where we start to see the mapping out of what it means to be alive and to be a being. And then we start seeing how what it means to be alive and being a being is roughly the same no matter what kind of being it is. There are certain universal rules. And the more we learn what these universal rules of what being alive means, crystals are alive, plants are alive, there's different states of being alive, but things that grow, things that are alive and grow, all follow certain patterns, one sacred geometry. No one can argue with the fact that sacred geometry, as weird as that sounds, is more true than any science than anyone else has ever come up with, because it describes how everything is made. Everything. Snow, rain, clouds, rocks, dirt, people. Sacred geometry explains all of this. So basically, the first thing that we can do if we want to have a real science that's not completely outweighed by the fault of the observer is we want to base it on sacred geometry. We want to have a check-in with a system that's greater than this. An analogy would be the best clocks in the world link up with a neutron star out there in space, because a neutron star is a much more reliable form of keeping time than anything on this planet. Everything on this planet wobbles a little bit and is inaccurate a little bit. We can go down to a very finite scale in subatomic particles, and we can get fairly accurate clocks that way. But even more accurate are neutron stars, which are pulsars, which send off a flash of radiation. It's really exciting. I really like astronomy. So pulsars I think are really amazing. They're the gateway in between worlds. But pulsars are so routine and regular that they're the most accurate form of timekeeping that we know. So if we're going to do any kind of science work, we have to double check it and triple check it. It has to be fractally true. We have to find a metaphor of what we're studying in a different form, in another area of life. We need to find at least two other forms. Triangulation is really important. Science has its own names for this, but triangulation, we need to be able to verify our data, and we need to be able to repeat it. So spirituality is basically just people verifying and repeating data over thousands and thousands of years, and when it works, it sticks. People are like, oh yeah, this works really well, we're gonna keep teaching this. So the scientific method is a wonderful tool. We should all be applying the scientific method as much as we can in our daily lives, but we should be using it for self-growth. We should be using it in a very simplistic and a very powerful way. We don't need to look outside. Problems that we experience are going to have an external component that's going to be separate from the internal component that's going to require its own dealing with. but the majority of the reason there was a problem to begin with has to do with internal. And life is just a series of challenges, so the more comfortable we get doing scientific method on ourselves, the faster we're going to be happy and get more of what we want. This is what it comes down to. This is why the scientific method is so amazing. It's basically just a way of saying, I'm not going to run away from myself. I'm signed up for this. I'm going to observe. So the scientific method says, look at these two factors. Look at what happens when you change one of these factors. What's the outcome? So for spirituality, for self-study, we want to basically take out those other factors. We don't want any factors. We want the only factor to be ourself and our observation of ourself. So we clean the slate. We want to be in a meditative state. The classical atmosphere for this kind of work is dimly lit rooms, quiet in nature, low lighting, soft. We want to just be focused internal. So the scientific method for ourself is going in and saying, okay, how do I feel right now? What am I thinking right now? What could that thought mean? Well, I had a talk with someone about this, and I had an emotional feeling around that. Okay, there's one. And I ate this food today, which might have upset my stomach. Okay, there's another. I slept enough, not enough, too much, whatever. So we can start just reviewing all these things with the scientific method. We say, okay, so I've mapped out roughly, say sleeping. I'm not sure why I'm not sleeping. So I've mapped out what's going on with my sleeping. Okay, food. I'm not eating food that's irritating me anymore, so I don't think it's that anymore because my food is feeling really good. Here's someone told me, a metaphor, an example. I've heard that getting natural light before going to bed is really important. So being witness to the evening light shift is one of the biggest natural cues for sleep. So we can go outside and test that. A good scientist will say, okay, well, we need to make sure that the data is extended over a long enough period of time for it to be relevant. So it's not just a little blip, because something could happen for just a week and then not happen again. So we need months of data. This is common for any kind of application of science. So going outside for a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks and seeing if there's a general improvement of sleep would be a way that we can start using the scientific method in our own life. And the more we can actually take data, actually physically write this down or type it up and keep records of it, it's more helpful. We don't have to do this. We can use our internal sense, and that's good enough for most of the time. But we can be scientists about it. We can take data and write this stuff down because it will help us immensely. I'm really into fermentation, into cooking and making recipes, all kinds of things. And I have trained myself to write it all down as much as I can, even if I don't want to and can barely get myself to do it. At least write a date, the ingredients lists, and the quantity of the ingredients, a very bare minimum, because years later when I say, oh yeah, I did that amazing food project, I made that fermentation, I want to know how I did that. I don't remember exactly how I did it. I don't want to fumble around and do experiments to figure out how to do it again. So I can look back at my notes. So again, the scientific method and being a scientist taking data is really, really valuable, but the one piece that is missing with the scientific method as it is used most commonly today is that it is used external instead of internal. It is virtually worthless when it's used external because there's so many internal factors that, unless we've reached a state of relative self-awareness where we are monitoring why we are having our thoughts and the feelings all the time, and we have a dozen answers for why we had a thought and why we had a feeling, and they're all variable, so we're not committed to just one true and the rest are false. When we're at this state where we're in constant self-awareness, we're aware of ourself, we're aware of what our feelings are meaning, not just that we have them, and what our thoughts are telling us and why we're having those thoughts, not just what the thoughts are telling us individually, then we are able to use the scientific method because we reached a state of self-awareness. So I don't think that any scientist is very credible until they get to the state. And when scientists do get to the state, they become very credible. We get people like Einstein and Tesla. We get people who have unlocked their higher brain functions. Modern science tells us, we don't use most of our brain. I don't remember what the percentage, 70, 90, like most of our brain we don't use. Why don't we use it? We've been trained not to. We've been trained to live in a box and to believe that us, the observer, doesn't affect the scientific method much. It's mostly just science, that spirituality is a hoax and that science is real. This is why our brains are not being used. We've been told not to use them. So spirituality is basically just using our higher brain function. It's everything else. It's everything that we have access to that we can do. Anything that Einstein or Tesla can do, we can all do. I mean, might not be able to do it right now, but we have the potential to be able to do it. There's no like being born, like, there's no inherent limitation. There can be some inherent limitations on our being depending on what our soul's journey is and depending on life circumstance. But for the most part, there's not just like a 1 in a billion lottery that one person gets to be smart and have higher brain function. That's not generally how it works. Generally, how it works is that there are very potent creative people that are allowed to follow up on their journey, that have the right situation, that have enough drive and motivation. And so the more we cultivate situations for this to happen, the more it's going to happen. We can choose to have brilliant, visionary scientists and leaders if we choose to birth them. If culturally we decide that that's relevant and important, we can create fertile grounds for brilliance. We don't do that. I don't know of any modern civilization in the world that cultivates grounds for brilliance. Within 60, 80 years, we could basically revolutionize anything on this planet if we spent that time, if we incubated and created this culture for creating brilliance. We would just solve all of our problems. Technology would be so many leaps and bounds ahead. Technology right now is military driven, so we're not really getting a whole lot of benefit from it because it's most of the time money and manpower and brain power and cultural idealism and everything you can possibly think of is all being warped into, pain. Causing pain, causing death and pain. So all we have to do is focus on causing brilliance, and we'll get brilliance. It's not that much of a stretch. We live in a fear, uncertainty, and doubt state. All of modern civilization, it's all run by the same, the same vicious gang that wants to be in control. The people who want power the most are going to get it. Is what it comes down to. The people who have detached themselves from empathy and morality to the point where the pursuit of power over others is for some reason more important to them. And this goes back to the third chakra. They never fully awoken to their third chakra. They played around with their first and second, and then they said they didn't want to go any further. So these psychopathic gang members that basically run the nations, they're larger than nations. They're just haven't gotten to the point where they have personal power. They can't say I want to be happy, I'm going to be happy. They lack this ability. They gave up on trying to acquire the ability for self-happiness, for being content, for being stable, for just enjoying being alive. They said that that's impossible. They made a religion out of saying that that's not possible. And so their religion is saying that controlling other people is where it's at. So the scientific method is primarily applied with the psychology of controlling other people because this is top down. This comes from the very top. This is how it's enforced. This is how it's politicians are trained. This is how the systems are trained from the top down, is to enforce power over others using the scientific method. So now we know why modern civilization breeds narcissism. It tells people to have control of other people, to trick other people into doing things for us, and to manipulate other people so that we have control over their feelings because we don't have control over our feelings. We're basically living in a daycare center with a bunch of toddlers, and these are the people that run everything. They're a bunch of toddlers who say, "Wow, you hurt my feelings, and I don't want to do something about it. I want you to suffer." This is the level of consciousness that we live with. So all we have to really do is recognize this and kind of laugh it off. Yeah, it's ridiculous and cruel, and it can be horrific, but we can kind of laugh it off as saying, really? These people don't have any moral authority. They don't have any logical authority. These people are so out of touch with reality. They don't know what they're talking about. They literally don't know what they're talking about anymore. They live in a world that's so divorced from reality that these are toddlers with hurt emotions that are running around hitting people because because their emotions were hurt. They're like, what? They're crying and lashing out and flailing their arms. This is the current state of politics. The people at the top are a bunch of babies that are whining and flailing their arms around. Unfortunately, they have like guns and tanks and jets and all this, snipers under their control. So when they flail their arms, it hurts a lot. They can cause a lot of damage. But let's be really clear that the level of psychology, the level of maturity, the level of consciousness, the level of intelligence, these people are very unintelligent people. They have isolated their focus into such a finite area that they have foregone intelligence. They have let go of being smart, and in pursuit of this isolated cult worship, they shut down huge parts of their brain. I think people have talked about, I've heard this most recently, as the lizard brainstem. So a lizard state of consciousness is when we are only concerned with our personal safety, our personal survival, and our ability to control other people's emotions. This is the lizard state of consciousness. It basically is before we get to personal power, the ability to be happy by ourselves without needing to control other people. So that's the lizard state of consciousness. It basically sees the world as trying to eat it, and it's trying to eat the world. That's the lizard state of consciousness. That unless I'm physically grabbing and taking from someone else, someone is taking from me. This is like, this is, again, toddlers. This is infantile. These states of consciousness that are prevalent, that currently the so-called leaders have, is infantile. So all we have to do is recognize this. We don't have to go out and protest. We don't have to go out and cause a fuss. I actually suggest we don't go out and cause a fuss in that way. I suggest we look internal for these changes. What we can do is delegitimize that. Because right now, the only way that they've become legitimate is by saying that they're legitimate. So all we have to do is delegitimize their authority. So again, we're not going to go out and, not pay our bills or go out and protest in front of atrocities, because we know that's going to cause problems for us. We know that's not going to accomplish anything. We know they have a system for dealing with that, and that's not going to affect them at all. It actually benefits them. There was a news article that exposed how the Chinese government was linked up to the company that produced riot control gear, and so the Chinese government actually profited by oppressing their people because they bought, tools, that they bought tear gas and batons from a company that they owned. So they were actually, making money by hurting people. So really, all we have to do is, one, stay safe and logical. Don't go ahead and do something crazy, and two, delegitimize the authority. They have no moral authority. All we have to do is remind ourselves of this every day, because we're told every day that they have authority, that they have moral authority, and that moral authority gets into our emotional body and our belief system, and people start to believe it. So we have to remind ourselves every day that these are infants, these are psychopaths, and that they have no moral authority. They can be violent and they can be mean, and we have to learn how to deal with that. But they don't have moral authority. They don't have logical authority. They don't have spiritual authority. They don't have intelligence. They don't have science. They have nothing backing them other than being angry and mean. So we just have to remember this, that these are angry, mean people. The way we defeat angry, mean people is by not being angry and mean. We create our own reality. So I am living under what I would consider very oppressive conditions. I can just, I could spend hours documenting how ridiculous my day-to-day life is, how many struggles I have to go through just to be alive. It's absolutely ridiculous. It's very, very, very challenging for me to conceive of the fact that I'm alive right now, considering what I've been through, and I've heard the story from a number of other people. So what we can take away from this is that I am the source of my own happiness. I've done enough self-study. I've gone to those ugly places and weeded out enough of whatever toxic programming that has been passed down through all of society. I'm not pointing fingers, but they come from all forms. The toxicity is everywhere. Our parents, our school teachers, anyone we've ever worked for, virtually anyone we've ever talked to is going to be passing down this toxic programming. And so all I have to do is say, okay, am I in any way being mean to someone else? Am I in any way externalizing something that's internal for me unconsciously? I've done this enough to the point where I have unlocked this ability to have power over myself. So, I can lose control every once in a while. I think most people can lose control every once in a while, but it takes a fair amount. I've gotten to the point where I can see really deep into the nature of reality, so a lot of things piss me off because I can really see that toxic programming. I can see when people are being mean just for the sake of being mean and are unconscious about this and have a story around it so they believe they are being nice or doing the right thing. This is infuriating, and I deal with this every single day. So I consider myself having a fair amount of personal power because I'm infuriated by bad behavior every single day, and I laugh it off as much as I can. It doesn't really get to me too much at the end of the day. The big things do get to me, and then I gotta process them a little bit more. When people go out of their way to be intentionally mean and cruel, and when people abuse their power, and when people are just disrespectful, that takes a little bit more. If people are just tossing down the standard slave programming, I've got pretty good at getting used to that. So again, going back to the scientific method, applying the scientific method to ourselves. This is the only real value of the scientific method, because if we don't have a method for mapping out where we are causing inaccuracies, what's the point of observing the outside world? I mean, if we're constantly changing on the inside and we're constantly telling the data to be a certain way, there's just no point in trying to explore this external. I had a number of conversations with my English teacher in college, and she introduced me to every single piece of literature that she had to comprehend and be able to write fluently on to become an English teacher. And it was a joke. She gave me 16 books, and I would hand them back to her then a day or two later and say, this has one single premise. This is a whole book of 400 pages with one premise. This one premise isn't very accurate. This is a tiny piece. You got to add 3 or 4 books together just to even get a concept here of anything, and it's not even a very good concept. And she's like, yeah, you're probably smarter than most of these people that wrote these books, and that's why you're here after hours in my office talking with me about cool stuff. So anyways, the scientific method, once it's applied internal, opens up a whole new world, because we create our own literary standard. The professional world does not have a proper literary standard. We have MLA format, as far as I know. MLA format is a specific way that we write scholarly documents, so they're very easy to read and very quick to read. So people in the scholarly community, in the science community, can very quickly look at a document, look at a book, and isolate the data they need from it very quickly. This is the MLA format. So it's a very valuable tool, but the MLA format does not have anything to do with accuracy or being concise or having a complete picture. So it's pretty much worthless. It doesn't care about how accurate your data is. It doesn't care. I mean, the MLA format is also woven into the culture of academia, and the culture of academia right now says that if you use more words to describe what you're talking about, you're doing a better job. I'm at a loss for words. This is the opposite. When we use very few words and we're able to convey a large amount of information in great detail, that is a sign of excellence. When we use a lot of words to say very few things, that's a sign of idiocy. So why does academia embrace idiocy? I'm at a loss for words. My English teacher couldn't come up with any herself. She does all her own independent research. She comes up with her own textbooks and her own study material. She thinks that the standard material they give her is garbage anyways as well. So we had a lot of being on the same page in that class. I actually was her unofficial TA. I love English. I've just been a natural writer. So when I was in her class, and whenever she would get to a stuck point, she was having a hard time figuring out how to explain to the class, I would just, I would explain to the class. I'm a very good translator. Sometimes these days I've been thinking of myself as a spiritual translator. I take things in this spiritual realm that are more complex. They're just more to them and less visible. They're only visible with our third eye. They're not visible with our external senses. And there's a lot more of it. It's like 98% of reality. We exist in 2% of reality. So I've gotten really good at translating these things, because I'm in dream state most of the time. I'm looking at all these things and watching them as they drift by. This is like my state of consciousness for my whole life. Thoughts and feelings and ideas drift by in a constant stream. And I've gotten better and better at the human experience, so that I can map out in empathetic terms what it means, where people have difficulty comprehending these new forms of science and these new forms of reality, and empathetically going through the stages of how it needs to be explained. Just a second. So a spiritual translator, I apply the scientific method to my own psyche, to my own ego, to my own emotional body, to my mental body, to my energetic body. I apply the scientific method as much as I can. And then I encounter these really big points. I try to find these big ones, like the scientific method is a huge, massive tool that's being misused, and I don't know of many people who, very spiritually astute, scientifically astute people have reached the same conclusion, but it's still not very widely talked about. It's still counterculture to say that scientific method is so flawed that it should not be used except on the self, and that once we've achieved self-mastery, at least third chakra, at least to the point where we're checking in on our thoughts and our emotions, that the scientific method is virtually worthless, and the scientific method should only be applied to self-study until that point. So these are the kinds of the things that I think about, and now that I've been able to, become more of the human condition, I've been in dream state most of my life, empathy is such a valuable tool. I am so sensitive, I have so much empathy, that I have been able to map out the difficult points of comprehending the translation of the languages. And so I feel out these little details, and I say, oh, okay, so this one little piece, once I've gotten to this point, it's super easy and small, and everyone else who's gotten there, they don't even think about it anymore. It's like one little step. But I empathetically know that that step was huge. It took me months, or it was painful, or there was some big thing. And I'm like, oh, well, there's probably a lot of other people with a very similar situation, because being human means being human. We're all about the same in certain ways. We all have to go through the same steps of evolution to reach higher states of consciousness. We all have to encounter many of the same things. So, for example, the nature of logic and the nature of manipulation. Empathetically, I experience this is where most people get hooked. Logic and the ability to translate, and psychology, and most people say, oh, what's that? That's too much. That's more than I can handle. So empathetically, I can say that I can translate this. I can say that logic is just being very clear. Logic doesn't mean anything other than being very simple and clear. Logic can be applied to anything. There's a logic to emotions. There's a logical way to process emotions. So logic is a really important word. And it's really also the second piece of this empathetic bridging that I'm doing right now, is that the emotional body and the mental body go hand in hand. Neither are superior, both are inferior. This is another huge piece, because I think that most of the world is still running under these belief systems, which I don't ascribe to any particular beliefs or systems of beliefs, that for some reason that the world has to be in thought or in feeling, and that these are the world, and that feeling represents more of women and thought represents more of men. This is just, again, a hoax to keep us in a lower state of consciousness. Thought and feeling are both inferior. Thoughts happen. They just happen. We don't need to, they just happen. Feelings are a product of our emotional body, and something they have a little bit to tell us, but they're mainly our experience of being alive. So everybody has to experience their feelings or suffer health consequences. This is the nature of our feelings. Our feelings are how we are in this world. And so I've talked about this before. They are in our low chakras. We do not want to be taking advice or direction from our feelings. We want to be studying them with a scientific method to extract data. I know that sounds super cut and dry, and it is. Spirituality is very cut and dry in certain areas. Spirituality is about filtering through the bullshit, filtering through the lies, the static, the stuff that doesn't need to be there, and just going for the one piece that's important. This is using the scientific method in a cut and dry way. So our emotions generally have something to tell us. If we feel off after an interaction, then we want to study that interaction. We want to replay that and figure out what was off. We don't want to just blindly listen to our emotional body and say, oh, I feel off from that situation. Now I'm going to shut down and just say that situation was the problem, that person was the problem. That is just a state of ignorance. That is enforcing ignorance. That is accepting unconsciousness. What we want to do is we want to say, okay, I felt off from that situation. One, was I feeling off to begin with? Maybe I was already feeling off and I was causing that to begin with. I've worked with farm animals a little bit, and they're very sensitive to emotion. So if I ever felt off a little bit, frustrated about something, and I started going to work with farm animals, I don't even need to do something offensive. They can just feel those emotions, like straight up feel it. If you have a cat and you get sad and your cat comes over and hangs out with you, farm animals, goats and chickens, they can feel that stuff. You walk into their pen and you're feeling a certain way, they're like, wait, you're already feeling upset. I'm not going to come near you, or I'm going to start butting up against you because I know you're in a kind of an angsty mood already. So again, really analyzing our feelings and saying, okay, well, did I have an effect on that? Anyways, zooming forward to the feeling part, we can say, okay, so that interaction, there's something that didn't go right in that interaction. Maybe it was me, maybe it wasn't me. I don't think it was me. Okay, what about that other person? I'm going to review all the things that other person did and said. Okay, and then I'm going to look over the dynamic. Is there a natural dynamic? Is there a natural inclination for emotions to flow a certain way? Is this just emotions that flowed in a way that was abrasive? Is there actually nothing here other than two emotional bodies that didn't rub the right way? Sometimes there's nothing there. It's just a little occurrence like that. Sometimes we can trace it. I'm going to say 99% of the time it's going to be a form of matrix slave programming is going to be why we felt off about something. It's very rarely going to be because someone had cruel intentions, but it's almost always going to be because someone has been programmed to be mean. That we've all been programmed to be mean and to hide this and to believe that it's okay and to accept it. I know parents. This is parents are taught to say I did my best. What is this? Radical forgiveness is to say I unconditionally forgive myself. Well, that's great. It's necessary. But if we don't actually go through and figure out what we did wrong, we're creating narcissism within ourselves. So we want to be able to unconditionally release all the bad stuff, but we need to learn from it first. We don't want to just go ahead and I see this that makes me want to throw up. I see these Facebook memes of sorry, thank you, I love you, this sequence of words, and people just spam it out and says, oh look, I'm so holy because I've repeated the magic phrase of 4 words. These are words that indicate internal processes, internal emotional processing, intellectual processing, and this takes work. If we're just saying it, we're giving lip service to it, this is fraud, this is fake, this is phony, this is ridiculous. Like, why even bother? This is a trend to be popular. Again, this is about getting attention, this is about placating the second chakra, this is about being unconscious. So what we really want to focus on is self-study. We really want to get in there and figure out why things happened, and we can comprehend the concept that the toxic programming is going to be the number one reason that's happening, but then we got to do something about it. We got to figure out how we can create boundaries, how we can create effective communication, because our job to exit the matrix and help everyone else exit the matrix and enter into bliss reality of creation where we create what we want, everybody together, is by showing each other the way. We find the way for ourselves and we need to show the way for other people. And the way that we do this is by being very empathetic and trying to find one little step that someone missed and finding the way that we comprehend will help them because it helped us. We say, I got really frustrated when I was trying to learn this. When people tried to tell me that, natural health practitioners would tell me over and over again, you are causing your own physical pain because of your emotions. Then they wouldn't say anything after that. This is them being mean. This is them regurgitating slave programming. This is pointing an accusatory finger without offering a solution. This is, what it means to be mean. To say, hey, I'm telling you you have a problem. I'm telling you why you have a problem. I'm not going to help you. And these were health practitioners. These were people who are paying money. So slave programming is everywhere. We need to be really careful. This is one of the reasons why I'm not going to say that any generation or age is immune to this, but generally the more years people have undergone slavery, the more of a slave they become. So younger people generally are easier to work with. On the other hand, before we've been able to map out our emotional body and come to terms with our emotional body, it can be much more difficult to have any tangible sense of anything. So there's also an age... sorry about that. I forgot to put Do Not Disturb on, and that is my new practice because I sometimes get phone calls and it interrupts. Anyways, so self-analysis, the scientific method on ourself, and then once we figure out successful tools, showing this to other people. So what I was just saying is that people used to accuse me of causing my problems and then didn't help me. They just were passing the buck of blame, pointing the blame finger. So what I can do is if I can see someone is causing their problems because they haven't faced their emotions, the number one thing I can do to help that person is not point a finger and say, hey, you're causing your emotions because you're causing your physical pain because you're not dealing with your emotions. I can say, how can I be in support of the experience you're having right now? What is an emotional difficulty that you're having that you would like support with? Or I can go a step further and I can be more evolved and I can already know what's going to be in support of that emotional process. I can walk up to the person and I can say, it's okay, I know this is difficult, or I want to be in support of you. You're welcome to tell me how I can be in support of you. Or sometimes we know the moment to give a hug. We know that there are certain moments when we can give someone a hug and it'll be so much more meaningful than any word we can come up with. So this is how we can really be in support of exiting the matrix and be in support of other people's process, and how we can support the true use of the scientific method. Let's reclaim the scientific method, because it's doing us no good creating bombs and demolitions and jets. It's really not doing us much good there. And that's mainly where it's used. And psychology, oh my god. Psychology right now is a debauchery of just like demons, basically. It's basically saying, oh, I'm right because I disproved all of you. No, I'm right because I disproved all of you. No, look, I was able to trick that person into doing that thing more successful than you were. So this is the state of psychology right now. Until we actually bring spirituality back into psychology, bring the scientific method to ourselves, and then bring it to the other world, it's just, we're going to get a bunch of confused, mean people. So I hope that everybody goes out and examines a little bit more of themselves and looks for a way that they can be empathetic to another person's experience, specifically in terms of raising consciousness. So when someone is getting stuck in an emotion or getting stuck in a thought, and we can experience what has helped us get past that and provide that support. So often the first step of this is experiencing the trigger of someone else being mean, dissolving that, and then going the step further and saying, okay, I have the solution to this. And also being very empathetic in the process, being self-aware of how our emotional body affects other people, so that we are not going to trigger them. Because part of being empathetic is not only being able to provide the support in the area it's needed, but providing it in a way that it's going to be received. We are intentionally walking across a floor full of broken glass to go help someone who's bleeding. This is kind of what we're doing. We want to look at it like this. We are not trying to cause any more force to happen here. If anything, we're trying to be as delicate and dainty as possible and say as little as possible, because psychology from the Matrix has told us that words are just to cause hurt. Words are just to try to get our needs met by manipulating, and to cause hurt, and to try to avoid being hurt, and to try to struggle. And then there's this little gray area in between where we're allowed to be human in between that. But if we read in between the lines, everything from saying good morning to saying bless you, these are all have their roots in slave programming. So unless we feel really good when we're saying something and really good when someone says something to us, we don't need to say it. There's all these social customs that people have built up that we're told keeps the world together, that are being polite and how we all stay civilized. This is the 180. This is the slave programming. This is saying that we have the expectation that someone has to say a certain routine of things or they're being mean. Now all of a sudden we live in a world where people can be labeled as being mean or disrespectful because they don't play along with the slave games. So if someone starts asking us about difficulty in our lives, we don't have to indulge that. That is part of slave programming. We don't want to be focusing on what's not working on our lives. We want to be focusing on making our lives work better. So if someone says, hey, are you still feeling sick? How did you get sick? We can redirect. We can say, you know what? That's my responsibility, and I am creating my better reality of being more healthy right now, and I am doing that by eating foods that are better for me, or I'm getting more sunlight now. So this is what it takes. We have to redirect, and people are going to be very frustrated with this because people don't like to be redirected. But this is where psychology comes in. This is spiritual psychology. It basically is not saying I have the upper hand and I'm right. It's basically just saying, look, here's flow. People experience it enough times, they'll get it. We don't want to force it because people are bought hook, line, and sinker. People are chained and hooked. People have open wounds around the slave system. People's open wounds are being, having vinegar and salt splashed on them constantly. This is the slave system. Keep people in pain. Keep people afraid. Keep people overwhelmed so they can't do anything. It's all illusionary. We don't have physical violence that much in this country compared to most other countries, but we have this profound cultural-wide effect of as if we had that because we do it all emotionally. And again, this happens everywhere. countries where they have less civilized practices, they tend to have tighter family units, and they tend to be a little bit more love-driven, although quote-unquote religion, the darkness within religion, the darkness that seeks to make money and profit off of religion, has done a good job of worming their way into the family structures of even fairly isolated communities. I spent a little bit of time with the Lacandon tribe in Chiapas in Mexico, and Christianity is full swing out there. These people, basically run around in the dirt, chop down trees to cook their food with, grow the Three Sisters, corn, beans, and squash, rotate their crops every single year, go fishing in the local ponds. These are very, very in tune with nature, and they have a little bit of electricity that's used to light up their shrine to the Mother Mary. So religion has really done a good job of spreading itself everywhere. And they have to pay for that electricity too. And it's like, more of their electricity goes to the shrine than to, anything that they use. Anyways, so calling out when it happens, finding an empathetic solution. Again, we want to do this all internal, because if we externalize any of this stuff, or people are going to be unhappy and they're going to have a reaction. So we don't want to be causing reactions. We just want to get to the bottom of it and find the empathetic solution. All right. Well, I hope you have a wonderful Friday morning.